Rocks and Stars and Dinosaurs, The Wonders of the World in Biblical Perspective. Lecture number 5, Cherubim, Dinosaurs, and Dragons. With a title like that, I shall have to perform. In this lecture, we are concerned with what the Bible has to say about animals and the animal kingdom. And the Bible has so much to say about different animals that there's no way we can do more than just skim the surface of it. And I'd like, in view of that, to talk generally about the Bible and animals and the Christian way of viewing them, and then move on to a topic that I think will be of tremendous interest to you and to your children. So let's talk about animals first of all. When we went to school, and as your children are in school, they'll study biology, and they'll learn how hearts work and how livers work, and they'll learn how to cut animals up, but they're not likely to study the ways of animals. The older naturalist view of science, more influenced by Christianity and tradition, studied the ways of animals and their habits and their habitats and what they did. But unfortunately, that study has not captured the imagination of the 20th century, nor is there much about it in our textbooks. Yet that is where the Bible focuses its attention. And we, as we want to look at the world through Bible eyes, are greatly impoverished because we don't know very much about the ways of animals. If we look back at Genesis chapter 2, we will see that the animals were made as images of men. Just as man is the image of God, so animals also imaged God who created them in a general kind of way, though they're not the special image of God as we are. But in a particular kind of way, animals were made to be very close to men, to serve men, and man was to learn things from observing the animals. And we see this in Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 18, a passage that's so familiar that perhaps we miss the point, or this particular point. There are many points here. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." And so the Lord caused Adam to go to sleep and made a helper suitable for him. No, that's not what we read. We read instead that after saying that the Lord would make a helper suitable for him, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky. This had already been done, and now certain specimens are made, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was his name. And the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and to every beast of the field. What does this have to do with the fact that the man needs a helper suitable for him? Well, then we read, "The man gave names to all these beasts, but for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him." Now, that's interesting. Now, if you were Adam, what would you think? Here you are, all alone. You're a man. Giraffes go by, hippopotamuses go by, and you name them, and you notice that each one of them has a mate. They come in sexual polar pairs. There's a male and a female. Well, what is Adam to learn from this? Well, maybe Adam should reason, well, these are animals. I'm not an animal. There's just one of me. But animals have mates. There's a male and a female. But that's not how Adam reasoned. If there was no analogy, if there were no analogy, let me put that in the subjunctive mood, if there were no analogy between men and animals, then that would have been a proper way to reason. Animals have mates, but I'm a man, and I'm not in any way like an animal, and so I don't have a mate. Actually, though, in the creation design of God, there are loads of analogies between men and animals. And Adam instinctively knew that. And so when Adam saw that all the animals had mates, he said, "Hey, where's mine?" And it was at that point that the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and the Lord took one of his ribs, and the man said in verse 23, "At last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So he knew, you see, that there was a need for a partner. The animals had partners. Now, the creation design of correspondences between men and animals exists for the purpose of wisdom, so that we can learn wisdom by observing the ways of animals. And this is what Adam did. He observed the ways of these animals and learned that he needed a spouse. Now, modern the modern evolutionary view has totally perverted that. They say, yeah, look at all the analogies between men and animals, and this proves that men and animals are biologically related. Men evolved from animals. And then the theistic creationists come along and say, well, the body of man evolved from animals, but then God created a soul and stuck it inside an animal body. This is totally wrong. It's a total misreading of the Christian position, and it's a total misreading of the facts. Yes, there are all kinds of analogies between men and animals, and we can use things from animals. We can study animals and learn things about men in all kinds of ways. But that's by creation design. It's not by evolution. Well, the point here is that animals were made to image man, to show divine and human characteristics. And thus, the book of Proverbs abounds in stories. I shouldn't say abounds. There are really not as many as you might think. But there are numerous animal stories in the book of Proverbs where we are to get wisdom from observing the animals. Go to the ant, thou sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. You see, consider the ant. Learn from it. All right? There are 4 things small on the earth that are exceedingly wise. The ants are not a strong folk, but they prepare their food in the summer. The badgers are not a mighty folk, yet they make their houses in the rocks. There are 3 things stately in their march, 4 that are stately when they walk. The lion, mighty among beasts, the strutting cock, the male goat, and a king. You see, the animals are like the man, and the man is like the animals. And of course, in the history of the world, animal stories have always been used for men, whether it's The Wind and the Willows, or Aesop's fables, or any number of other stories where animals are said to be like people, and stories about animals are designed to show us things about ourselves. Animal characteristics. Well, my goodness, how much is there to say on this, and we don't have time for it. Some remarkable work has been done, however, by the Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, and the information on that is in your bibliography. Now, in that animals image the life of man, and we are to learn from them, the Bible tells us that because of the fall of man, the animals also fell. Many of them became violent, some became disgusting, and animals came to be in the categories of clean and unclean. And we don't know exactly when God told everybody about clean and unclean animals, but we know that when Noah took the animals on the ark, he took clean and unclean animals on the ark. In Genesis chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 7, verse 2. You shall take with you of every clean animal 7 pairs, a male and a female, and of animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female. So there were clean and unclean animals. And this distinction between clean and unclean animals existed right before and after the flood. And after the flood, Noah was told that he could eat any of the animals that he wanted to eat, whether they were clean or unclean. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 3, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you. Now, occasionally you run into Christians who think we ought to keep the Mosaic dietary laws. When you run into them, show them this verse. God said to Noah, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you. There's no question about the meaning of that text. The Mosaic dietary laws were temporary, symbolic provision for Israel. Now, what about these clean and unclean animals? They knew the distinction between clean and unclean animals before the flood, when it's possible men didn't even eat animals, and after the flood, when they could eat any of them they wanted. And then when the Mosaic law came along, God said, I don't want you to eat the unclean ones. Up till now you could eat the unclean ones, but from now on, I don't want you to eat any unclean ones. Then, of course, Jesus came and cleansed the world, and Peter was told that he could eat any of them that he wanted in Acts 10 and 11. What about this distinction between clean and unclean? Well, basically, unclean means dirty, and the ground is cursed. And so if you get dirty and the ground is cursed, then you're getting the curse on you, right? Think about it. The ground is cursed and you get dirt on you, and that means you get the curse on you. And so, Let's say that you go out in your bare feet and your feet get dirty. Well, they're not just dirty in the dirty sense, ordinary sense. You wash them off with soap, but they're also unclean because you've got this curse on you, the curse of the ground. Now, when Jesus died, He paid the penalty for that curse. The thorns were put on His head and a crown of thorns, and He took the curse. And in His resurrection, the world was cleansed. And so this distinction between clean and unclean doesn't exist anymore in the New Testament. We still have right and wrong. We still have the table of demons and the table of the Lord, but we don't have clean and unclean animals, and we don't have an unclean ground. But in the Old Testament, you may remember, and on into Jesus' time as well, if you came into someone's house, they washed your feet. And why all this talk about foot washing? Well, because the ground was cursed. And you might get dust on your feet, and you had to wear shoes to keep your feet off the ground. Clean animals are animals that have shoes. Unclean animals don't wear shoes. They walk on the pads of their feet. That's the way they're described in Leviticus 11. Their feet are in contact with the dirt, and so they remind us of the curse. The curse is death. So any animal that hangs around death is unclean. If it's an animal that eats dead things, eats carrion, eats manure, then it's unclean. It's like a violent man who lives in death and eats dead things. Animals that are violent in their lifestyle are like the serpent, and so they are unclean. Remember the curse on the serpent? Genesis 3, "Cursed are you more than all cattle. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat. You'll crawl in the cursed ground, and you will eat the cursed ground." And any animal that swarms around or crawls in the dust and doesn't have shoes is unclean because it's like the serpent. And any animal that eats dirt, eats manure, eats carrion, eats things that are on the ground that are returning to dirt, is unclean. And that's the rule. Now, when you get to fish, the rule is slightly different. And when you get to birds, the rule is slightly different. Leviticus 11 is a very complicated chapter, full of all kinds of wisdom and insight into the animal kingdom. And I can refer you to it, to read it and think about it. And there are notes in your notebook, and there is some information in the bibliography of where you might go to get more on this subject. But animals were made by God to assist us. After all, we have to ask, why didn't God just make a whole bunch of people and put them on a flat plain and say, okay, live? We didn't need to have trees, did we? Did we need to have animals? God could have just caused manna to be there, and people could have eaten that for thousands of years, and there would have been a human society without any of these other things. But God made these things to teach us, to learn wisdom, to help us mature and grow. And animals particularly have that function as we study their ways. Well, if you want to get into it and look at the clean and unclean animals, that'll help you a lot in understanding the ways of animals. And the material from the Gothard Institute is also particularly enlightening along those lines. Well, so much on animals. Let's turn to dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are fascinating. As a child, of course, I had a book of dinosaurs, and you probably did too. At least if you were a little boy, you probably did. And I'm sure there were plenty of little girls who had dinosaur books too. And as the years have gone by, it seems as if dinosaurs have become more and more popular. There's more and more about them in the news and in National Geographic and other places, simply because there's so much speculation as to how they lived. Scientists are not sure what the dinosaurs were. Were they reptiles? Were they more like birds? What were they? It's hard to know. They're all gone. And I think the Bible indicates to us why they're gone. And we'll get to that. Dinosaurs. Kids love them. You go into toy stores now, and they're toy dinosaurs, they're wind-up dinosaurs, they're inflatable dinosaurs, they're dinosaur stickers, and of course they're dinosaur books. And if your child is a dinosaur lover, then you want to share with him what the Bible has to say about dinosaurs. Well, we know from the Bible that the world is not millions and millions of years old, and so all the stuff they teach you in secular school about the age of the dinosaurs is wrong. Actually, the dinosaurs were made in Genesis 1, as we'll see, and they lived before the flood. But since Noah took on the ark 2 of everything, 2 of every unclean animal anyway, and 7 pairs of every clean animal. He took dinosaurs, probably little ones, on the ark as well. And so the dinosaurs existed in the world after the flood also. And that's where all these legends and stories about dragons and great monsters come from. There really were monsters in the ocean back then that are drawn on maps. And there really were dragons and dinosaurs and big reptiles roaming around the world in the ancient times. They're gone now. Why are they gone? Well, let's look at what the Bible has to say about them. The Bible does talk about them, and the Bible gives us a couple of long descriptions of dinosaurs over in the book of Job. In Job chapter 40, verses 15 to 24, we read about a dinosaur named Behemoth. Now, the margin of my Bible says, "Behold now Behemoth the Hippopotamus." Now, I'm going to read this, and as you listen, you tell me whether this sounds like a hippopotamus or not. "Behold now the Behemoth, which I made just as I made you, Job. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar." Did you know that the hippopotamus has a tail like a cedar tree? That's a new one on me. I've seen hippos before, and their tail does not look very cedar-esque. It looks like a thumb. It's not very impressive. And I don't know that they ever bend it. I think this is a dinosaur, and so do the creation scientists of today. It's pretty obvious it is, and if the translators and commentators weren't so blind to the fact that dinosaurs must have existed in the ancient world, they would see it as well. He bends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Now, I think that's a reference to Genesis 1, and we'll come to it in just a minute. The dinosaurs were particularly wondrous works of God. "Let his maker bring near his sword. Surely the mountains bring him food, and all the beasts of the field play there. Under the lotus plants he lies down, in the covert of the reeds in the marsh. The lotus plants cover him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him." Well, that might be true of the hippopotamus, but it was also true of the large dinosaurs. From what we can tell, they sat around the water quite a lot. When they got real big, it was hard for them to maneuver on the ground. If a river rages, he's not alarmed. He's confident though the Jordan rushes to his mouth. Can anyone capture him when he is on watch? With barbs, can anyone pierce his nose? Well, I think you can capture hippopotamuses, but I think it would have been pretty hard to capture a brontosaurus. Well, there's the Behemoth, and here is the Leviathan in Job 41. And I think it's worth reading this whole chapter and just thinking about it. Leviathan. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? My Bible says the crocodile. Well, this is not a crocodile. Or press down his tongue with a cord. Can you put a rope in his nose? Yeah, you can put a rope in the nose of a crocodile. People did it all the time in the ancient world. Can you pierce his jaw with a hook? Sure, you can pierce the hook of a crocodile with the jaw. You can pierce the jaw of a crocodile with a hook. But you can't do that to this baby. Will he make supplications to you? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him for a servant forever? You going to be able to capture this dinosaur? No. Will you play with him as with a bird? Will you bind him for your maidens? Will the traders bargain over him? Will they divide him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or lay his head with fishing spears? Well, yeah, you can do that to a crocodile, but you can't do it to this. Lay your hand on him and remember the battle, because you'll never do it again. Behold, your expectation is false. Will you be laid low even at the sight of him? No one is so fierce he dares to arouse him. Who then is he that can stand before me? If the Leviathan is so great, says God, and nobody dares tamper with him, then how do you dare tamper with me? The Leviathan is kind of a special emblem of God's power. Who has given to me that I should repay him? Everything under the whole heaven is mine. Then God goes on. He talks about the greatness of this water dinosaur. We've seen a land dinosaur, Behemoth. Now we have a water dinosaur. I will not keep silence concerning his limbs, or his mighty strength, or his orderly frame. Who can strip off his outer armor? Who can come within his double mail? Sound like a dinosaur? I think so. Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth there is terror. Strong scales are his pride. Shut up as a tight seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another. They clasp each other and cannot be separated. Now listen to this. His sneezes flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. He has bright, shining eyes. Out of his mouth go burning torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils smoke goes forth, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes forth from his mouth. Now here we have a fire-breathing dinosaur. Now the Creation Research Society has shown how this could be the case. Now, there's plenty of literature from the ancient world about fire-breathing dragons and fire-breathing dinosaurs. And here is an example. This isn't a myth. Job is not being told to consider symbolism here. There's plenty of symbolism in the Bible, but this is not a symbolic passage. God doesn't come to Job and say, look, Job, I want you to think about the myths of the dragons and compare them to me. No, God says to Job, look, Job, step outside and take a look across the mountain there at that behemoth over there. You've seen him every day of your life. And Job, you know about the water dinosaur. You've heard about him. You've read about him. You've made trips. You've seen him in the distance. You've seen him turn the water to steam. God is telling Job to look at things that are really there in the real world, created things. And whatever extra symbolic dimension all of this may have, the bottom line is these things were really there. You know, the temple and the tabernacle were symbolic, but they were also real buildings. And this dinosaur may symbolize the mighty power of God and His judgment, but the fact is he was really there. And Job could see him. In his neck lodges strength, and dismay leaps before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together, firm on him and immovable. His heart is hard as a stone, hard as a lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty tremble because of the crashing. They are bewildered. The sword that reaches him cannot avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He regards iron as straw, bronze as rotten wood. These things bounce off the scales of this monster. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones are turned into stubble before him. Clubs are regarded as stubble. He laughs at the rattling of the javelin. His underparts are like sharp potsherds. He spreads out like a threshing sledge on the mire. He makes the depths boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a jar of ointment. Behind him he leaves a wake to shine. He makes a wake to shine. No one would think the deep to be gray-haired. Nothing on the earth is like him, one made without fear. He looks on everything that is high, and he is king over the sons of pride. Well, these are wondrous works, especially wondrous works, and they're described here in the Bible. Two of them, the behemoth on the land and the Leviathan in the water. Now, the dinosaurs were created in Genesis chapter 1, verse 21. And the language used there is significant. It says, God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. The word is create, not make. In Genesis 1, there are two different words used. God created the heavens and the earth, God created the great sea monsters, and God created man. Other things are said to be made, or brought forth, or put. Now, some have said that this word create means to make out of nothing, and it usually implies that, but the actual word means to make a wondrous work. It's used for particularly wondrous, marvelous things. And the fact that the world is created indicates it's made out of nothing. Man is created, although made from the dust of the ground. And then these great sea monsters are created, which sets up an analogy between them and humanity. They're the only two things that are specially created, that are special, wondrous works. And I think it's because these great, huge, wondrous, beautiful things had analogies to men in glory and power. And they were created good. There's nothing wrong with these dinosaurs when they were created. They were friendly. Genesis 1 verse 31 says that God saw all that He had made and it was very good. And similarly, David in the Psalms, Psalm 148, verse 7, praise the Lord from the earth, sea monsters and all deeps. And so these are good things. And they may be gone and extinct now, but they were good while they lasted. They were created as wondrous works, and surely they were. You know, pictures of dinosaurs in books usually have them as gray or brown, but I'll bet you that they were iridescent. Because of the analogy between dinosaurs and cherubim that I will seek to show you as we move along here, I think that the dinosaurs probably had very beautiful scales. And lizards do today. There are many lizards with beautiful colored scales. And so do serpents. I mean, we don't usually think of snakes as beautiful, but the fact is that diamondback snake is got a lovely pattern to it. And I imagine those dinosaurs were very striking and beautiful and glorious to look at. Their scale looked like jewels. Well, unfortunately, this was the greatest and wisest and most intelligent of all the animals. You know, we think of cats and dogs as intelligent, and rabbits as not particularly intelligent. We had a rabbit for a while. We also had a dog, and there was no doubt about which one was smarter. And some animals are just dumb, that you can't teach them to do anything. They don't do anything. They don't have any intelligence. Other animals are much more intelligent. And the dinosaurs were the most intelligent and wise of all the animals that God had made. And we're told that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. The serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. You see, this has to be a reference to the dinosaur. And the reason is that throughout the rest of the Bible, the serpent's called a dragon many times. And he is called the wisest and most beautiful, or by implication most beautiful. And we should think in context back to this special creative act in Genesis 1. And when he fell, Satan possessed him. Then the dinosaur becomes a symbol of God's enemies. A symbol of God's enemies. And throughout the Bible, usually, except for the passages in Job that we looked at in Psalm 148 verse 7, usually the passages that refer to dinosaurs refer to them as symbols of God's enemies. The great powers of the world, Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, compared to dragons and dinosaurs. Well, Genesis 3 hints at the extinction of the dinosaurs because they're God's enemies. In Genesis 3, 14 and 15, because you've done this, God says to the serpent, cursed are you more than all cattle. You are blessed more than all cattle. Now you're cursed. And you're cursed more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go. You'll lose your legs, and you'll become the snake. And dust shall you eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he will crush your head, and you will bruise him on the heel. Well, you know, in the Christian era, there's no records of any dinosaurs. And I think that the work of Jesus Christ coming in the middle of history probably coincided with the passing of the dinosaurs from the world. Now there may be one or two left. Maybe there's some type of dinosaur in Loch Ness. I don't know. But they certainly aren't roaming around where we can see them. Essentially, they're gone. And I think that the passing of the dinosaurs is a sign to us of the coming of the kingdom. It's a symbol of the breaking of Satan's power, that the serpent has been destroyed. I mean, the great, big, huge, monstrous serpents who thundered the earth when they walked across the scene, they're gone. They were there for thousands of years, but now they're gone. And their passing shows the coming of the kingdom. The extinction of the dinosaurs is parallel to another event in history, and that's the elimination of leprosy. What we think of as leprosy today is Hansen's disease, and it's not the same disease at all as what the Bible is referring to when it uses the word we translate as leprosy. And this is confusing because we've got a word, leprosy, that's being used for two different diseases. Leprosy in the Old Testament was something that got on your skin. There's nothing about rotting away your limbs or your bones, but it would get on your skin, and it could turn your skin white all over. And it could also get into your house, into the walls of your house, and be embedded in the stones, and the house would have to be torn down and burned if it became infected with leprosy. Well, Jesus went around cleansing lepers, and there isn't any leprosy in the world today. And I think that the fact is that scholars and medical scientists and others that have looked into the Old Testament don't have any idea what this disease was. It's gone. It's been eliminated. And the impression we get is that Jesus eliminated it right there in the first century. And the elimination of leprosy, I think, is a picture that the kingdom has come, and that the filth and uncleanness that it represented is passed away. And similarly, I think the extinction of the dinosaurs points to that as well. They're gone. They're no longer with us. We have their bones. The dinosaurs were used by Satan to terrorize men and initially to rebel against man, and they existed in the ancient world. But when we get down to the early Christian centuries, even the centuries just before the coming of Christ, there's very little about them, and they're gone. They're made. Now, we'll have more to say about the dinosaurs in the Bible after we look at the cherubim, because the cherubim, as we see them showing up, seem to have analogies to the dinosaurs, and there is an analogy that we need to look at that will help us to understand what the Bible says about them, and have additional insight into how to view our coffee table books of dinosaurs. The cherubim were created to guard the throne of God. We see this in the Bible. They are, whenever we see into heaven and see the heavenly throne of God, we see the cherubim positioned around it with their amazing forms. They shout, "Holy, holy, holy," and they keep the enemies of God away from Him. The cherubim are complicated creatures. Sometimes they have 4 faces, sometimes they have 2, sometimes they have 1, sometimes they have 6 wings, sometimes they have 4, sometimes they have 2, sometimes they're filled with eyes. But they're beautiful and majestic, complex creatures that exist in heaven. Now, when God created the earth, He created the heavens and the earth at the same time, but when He planted the Garden of Eden, He set man to be the guardian of Eden. Genesis 2:15, the Lord set man in the garden to dress it and to keep it. The word keep means guard. Man was to guard the gate of Eden and keep the serpent out, but he failed to do so. Ezekiel chapter 28 discusses the man as the guardian, the cherub that guarded in the Garden of Eden, and his failure to do that. So if man is like an earthly cherub who guards the throne of God, well, after man refused to guard the garden, angels were put in as substitutes. They were given the flaming sword, and the cherubim were stationed at the 2 sides of the gate of Eden to keep men away from it. They were given the keys of the kingdom, and they were positioned at the door to lock and unlock. And throughout the Old Testament, whenever we see a gate or a doorway that leads to God, we always find the cherubim there and the threat of the flaming sword. The curtains of the tabernacle, of its several doorways, were all embroidered with cherubim. The doors of the temple had cherubim carved on them. When the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, approached with unholy fire in Leviticus chapter 10, then the 2 guardian cherubim that sat on either side of God's throne on the mercy seat sent out that flaming sword and consumed them. And so the cherubim barred the way to Eden down through the centuries, and man could not get back in to where God's holiness was found. But in the new covenant, everything has changed. Jesus has opened the way for us, and now we can all go in. And the cherubim have yielded the flaming sword back to the new Adam, who now is the guardian of God's throne, Jesus Christ. And all of us who are in union with Him and seated with Him in the heavenlies share in that guardianship. Jesus says that He has been given the keys of the kingdom, and now He is in charge of the doorway once again, and He has passed the keys of the kingdom to the church. And so that is what the cherubim are. They are the guardians of God's throne, and we, in the ancient hymn says, "We who mystically represent the cherubim and carry God borne on our shoulders as a mighty conqueror." And that's certainly true. We in the church are like cherubim, guarding God's holiness and affirming His righteousness. Well, the cherubim were these great, wondrous, marvelous creatures, and they're still there in heaven, as John sees in the book of Revelation. Lucifer was a cherub. You remember? One of the cherubim. And when Lucifer falls, he is called the dragon. So what is a dragon? A dragon is a counterfeit cherubim. A dragon is a fallen cherub. A dragon is Lucifer, the son of the morning, the fallen cherub. Now with that in mind, you see, the dragon is also like the dinosaurs. So I think that we are on pretty safe ground in saying that there's an analogy between the good cherubim and the good dinosaurs on the earth. And there's an analogy between Satan, the dragon, the fallen cherub, and the bad, frightening dinosaurs here on the earth. And that analogy is set up in the Bible in numerous ways we can't take time to look at, but just think about what you may know about these things. If you read in Ezekiel 1, the description of the cherubim, and look over in the book of Revelation, you find that they have many faces and that they're filled with eyes. All right? If we look over in Revelation chapter 17, verse 3, at the scarlet beast, we find that he has heads, many heads, and he was filled with blasphemous names, just as the cherubim were filled with eyes. And the dragon, the beast, the monster that shows up in Daniel and Revelation is a composite being. He is like several animals put together with many heads. Well, that's just what the cherubim are like. They have a man-like face, an eagle-like face, an ox-like face, and a lion-like face. They're composite beings. And so the Bible indicates to us that the dragon is the fallen cherub. And analogous to that, the threatening monstrous dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex, why, he's a dragon, he's like Satan. And the kindly disposed dinosaurs, like maybe Brontosaurus, who knows? They are like the good cherubim. Well, if we look back in the history of the world, we find legends that reflect biblical information. The dragon is supposed to have a hoard of jewels that he guards by circling his tail around it. And men try to get in and kill the dragon to get that hoard. Well, if we go back to the Garden of Eden, that's where the jewels are. They're in Eden, remember? And that's where the most wonderful things of all are. Knowledge and wisdom and power, locked up by God and guarded by the cherubim. Well, in the confusion of paganism, you see, the cherubim have become like the dragon. Satan has influenced them to think that he is the one who is guarding all these things, and they have to come to him, the fallen cherub, in order to get them. Even in J.R.R. Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit, we have Smaug the dragon. Obviously a pun. If you lived in London and you were reading that story, then Smaug the dragon would remind you of the weather conditions in London. But Smaug has got this hoard of jewels, you see, and he's hoarding them up. And they have to get rid of him in order to get the jewels. Well, those are legends, you see, that reflect the original Bible story, and they reflect a confusion between the cherubim and the dragon. We know that the cherubim are the ones who are actually guarding God's holiness and all the secrets of wisdom and power and riches. That is, until Jesus Christ came along. But in the pagan mythologies, it's not cherubim, but it's dragons who do it. Either way, it shows us that how the pagan world had a dim reflection of the truth that the Bible reveals. Well, the Bible gives us dragon dinosaurs. Dinosaurs uses the dinosaurs, several different ones, as symbols for draconic powers that raise themselves up against God. There are three dinosaurs we might mention: Tannin, Leviathan, and Rahab. 1 First of all, there's the tannin, T-A-N-N-I-N. Which dinosaur this was, I have no idea. Was it Stegosaurus? Was it Tyrannosaurus? We don't know. But he was a monster. Psalm 91 verse 13 tells us that we as Christians will tread on the lion and the cobra, the young lion, and the dragon, the tannin, you will trample down. Now, to show his power over the dragon, over the tannin, God caused Aaron's rod to turn into a dragon. Must not have been a very big one, but in Exodus chapter 7, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in verse 8 and said, when Pharaoh speaks to you saying, work a miracle, then you say to Aaron, throw your staff. Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh that it might become a dragon. Tannin. And so he did. And then the magicians of Egypt threw down their staffs, and they turned them into serpents, into tannins. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. So God's dragon, God's good dinosaur, was able to defeat the wicked dinosaurs of the Egyptians. And there's one more reference to the tannin, symbolic reference over in Exodus 29. Ezekiel 29. Verse 3. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster that lies in the midst of the rivers. Referring to the tannin, great tannin. Pharaoh is like the tannin, and his two tannins were destroyed by Aaron's tannin. Well, then there's the Leviathan. The Leviathan we've already looked at. There's a reference to him in Psalm 104, verse 26. Where we read that he sports in the ocean where God has given him to live. And then in Psalm 74, verses 13 and 14, we read that God has worked mighty deliverance in days of old. He crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. And in verse 13 it says, thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou didst break the head of the sea monsters in the waters. Well, that's a reference to Egypt. And the Leviathan here is a symbol for Egypt and the passing of Israel through the Red Sea and the destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. Similarly, Isaiah chapter 27 verse 1 tells us that in the days to come the Lord will punish the wicked, and in that day the Lord will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan the twisted serpent. He will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. And so judgment is coming upon the Leviathan, and I guess it has, because he doesn't exist anymore. And the world powers that he symbolized, the Egyptians, Babylonians, and others who raised up their tremendous, mighty, glorious scales against the people of God, they also are gone. Finally, there's a dinosaur called Rahab, R-A-H-A-B. In Hebrew, this is not the same word as the harlot Rahab, who is famous from the book of Judges. But the dinosaur Rahab is referred to in Job chapter 9, verse 13, and Job 26, 12 to 13. And there's a reference to him in Psalm 89, verse 10, the Rahab dinosaur. And this Rahab dinosaur is also compared to Egypt. Thou thyself didst crush Rahab like one who is slain, says David's friend Ethan the Ezrahite. In Isaiah chapter 30, verse 7, even Egypt, whose help is vain and empty, therefore I have called her Rahab, who has been exterminated. My goodness, perhaps this particular dinosaur was already gone by Isaiah's day. And then in Isaiah 51, verses 9 to 10. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not thou who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not thou who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, for the redeemed to cross over? Well, you see, there's a reference to Rahab as a symbol for the Egyptians, the great dragon-like power that raised up its ugly head against the people of God. Well, the Bible tells us that the dragon has been judged in Jesus Christ, and in Revelation chapter 12 he's cast down to the earth by Michael. And in Revelation chapter 20, he's bound for 1,000 years. And then at the end of Revelation chapter 20, he's cast into the lake of fire where he will never get out. That's what happens to Lucifer, the dragon. And as a symbol of that, as a token that God's judgments are secure, Satan's earthly dinosaurs are gone. Well, I hope that when you pick up your book of dinosaurs, this will give you a new look. The dinosaurs were created by God, especially beautiful and powerful. Satan used a dinosaur to bring man into rebellion. And God wiped the dinosaurs out as a sign that his kingdom was secure and that Satan's kingdom was destroyed. This is the end of lecture number 5, Cherubim, Dinosaurs, and Dragons.